My dad mocked me as uneducated and worthless. Then I told him who I really was. At 29, I had learned that my family trusted appearances more than facts. My father, Richard, believed success should be visible from the driveway. The right car, the right club membership, the right suit, the right people laughing at your jokes. My older sister, Abigail, had absorbed the same religion of display. She measured good years in handbags, vacation photos, and the number of people who asked where she had bought her dress. Her husband, Bradley, had built an entire personality around being a technology founder. He used words like scale, disruption, acquisition, and runway, even at breakfast. In that household, I was the one person who seemed to have nothing impressive to announce. I worked from a bedroom office, usually in sweatpants, with 2 monitors, noise-canceling headphones, and a laptop that almost never left the house. Richard saw no commute, no corner office, no company car, and decided I did not have a serious career. Abigail saw plain clothes and decided I had no money. Bradley saw me decline to argue and decided I was easy to dismiss. None of them knew that I held a master's degree in accounting, earned a 6-figure income, and worked as a senior forensic auditor on matters involving corporate fraud, disputed transactions, and asset tracing. I had never hidden my education as part of some elaborate secret plan. I simply stopped volunteering details after learning that Richard could turn anyone else's accomplishment into a competition. If I mentioned a difficult case, he asked why I was not a partner. If I mentioned a raise, he asked whether it came with a title worth printing on a business card. Silence became easier. Over time, their assumptions hardened into a family story. Sarah stayed home because she had failed to launch. Sarah wore cheap clothes because she had no ambition. Sarah lived in Richard's house because Richard was generous enough to tolerate her. The story was false in almost every important detail, but they repeated it so often that even relatives began speaking to me with the soft encouragement people use around someone they believe has fallen behind. The largest lie concerned the house itself. 5 years earlier, when my grandmother died, she left her paid-off 4-bedroom colonial estate solely to me. Richard was her only son, and nearly everyone assumed the property would eventually pass to him. But my grandmother had spent decades watching him spend money for the pleasure of being seen spending it. She loved him, but she did not trust him with leverage. A few months before her death, she called me into the sunroom, placed a folder of estate papers on the table, and told me that a debt-free home was a foundation, not a prop. "Your father is a peacock," she said. "He cares more about the feathers than the bird. If he controls this house, he will borrow against it to impress people who will not remember his name in 10 years. She had already worked with her attorney to make the transfer clean. After probate, the deed was recorded in my name. Richard received money and personal property under the will, enough that he never pressed hard about the house paperwork. He simply continued living there as though possession and ownership were the same thing. I let him. I paid the property taxes, insurance, major repairs, and maintenance. To avoid turning every bill into a family argument, I routed many expenses through a small property management LLC. When the furnace died in January, I authorized the replacement. When a storm damaged the roof, I paid the contractor. When the county tax notice arrived, I handled it before Richard ever saw a warning. He accepted the comfort and supplied the public explanation. At neighborhood barbecues, he spoke about maintaining the family estate. At church, he told people he allowed his younger daughter to live at home while she figured out what to do with her life. At dinner, Abigail thanked him for giving me a roof over my head. I heard all of it and kept telling myself that peace was worth more than credit. That decision did keep the household stable, but it also taught Richard something dangerous. He could use what belonged to me while believing I would never challenge the story he told about it. The arrangement showed itself most clearly in small household moments. Richard liked to hold what he called family budget talks at the kitchen island, though he rarely brought actual numbers. He would complain about the rising cost of utilities, golf dues, groceries, or landscaping, and then announce what everyone else should sacrifice. Abigail usually nodded while carrying a coffee that cost more than the lunch she criticized me for packing. Bradley talked about cash flow in broad terms without ever showing a statement. I usually listened because the expenses that could truly damage the property were already handled. Once, after a plumbing line burst behind the downstairs wall, I spent an afternoon coordinating an emergency contractor, approving the repair, and paying the deposit through the property company. That evening, Richard told a neighbor he had called in a favor to get the house fixed quickly. Another time, I renewed the homeowner's insurance before a lapse and then listened to him lecture me about responsibility because I had left a pair of running shoes near the stairs. The contradiction bothered me, but not enough to start a war. My work had taught me how often people protected identities they had built around themselves. Richard needed to be the provider. Abigail needed to be the successful daughter. Bradley needed to be the brilliant founder. I convinced myself that I could let them keep those identities as long as they did not interfere with the legal ownership underneath them. That was the mistake. I treated their performance as harmless because I knew the truth. They treated my silence as permission because they did not care whether the truth existed. 3 weeks before Richard's retirement gala, that arrangement still looked ordinary from the outside. On Sunday morning, we attended the same church we had attended since I was a child. Richard shook hands at the entrance, as if he were already campaigning for the retirement tributes he expected at the end of the month. He introduced Abigail and Bradley to 2 banking colleagues near the fellowship hall and described Apex Tech Solutions as one of the most promising young companies in the region. Bradley smiled, thanked him, and kept one hand in his pocket around a phone that vibrated twice during the conversation. When Richard introduced me, he said only, "And this is Sarah. She works from home." One of the men asked what I did. Before I could answer, Richard laughed and said, "Something with spreadsheets. She likes a quiet life." I watched the man's polite interest disappear and decided not to correct my father in the church lobby. The service passed with Richard whispering reminders about the family dinner he wanted everyone to attend afterward. Abigail spent most of the final hymn studying a message on Bradley's screen. Bradley whispered something back, then stood too quickly when the congregation was dismissed. In the parking lot, he took a call beside his car and turned away from us. I could not hear the words, but I saw his shoulders tighten. 10 minutes later, he returned smiling and announced that a client had needed him urgently. Richard clapped him on the back and said that was the burden of being important. Back at the house, Sunday dinner became the familiar theater of hierarchy. Richard opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for his retirement month. Abigail placed a new Prada bag on a chair where everyone could see it. Bradley carved the roast while talking about growth, investors, and server capacity. I carried vegetables from the kitchen and sat at the far end of the table in a plain gray sweater and dark jeans. I was not trying to make a statement with the clothes. They were comfortable, clean, and irrelevant to the work waiting on my laptop upstairs. To Richard, however, they were evidence. He looked from Abigail's handbag to my sweater with the satisfaction of a man comparing 2 daughters for an audience. Before he could begin, Bradley's phone buzzed against his leg. He silenced it. It buzzed again. The 3rd time, the screen turned just enough for me to catch a single word before he covered it with his palm. Collections. Bradley cleared his throat and pushed the phone face down. Then he lifted his glass and began talking even more loudly about an investment round that, according to him, was attracting serious interest from Silicon Valley. Richard leaned forward, delighted. I listened to the claims and watched the details that did not match them. Bradley's damp collar, the way he avoided looking at Abigail, the speed with which he dismissed each call, and the fact that a supposedly booming company suddenly seemed unable to give its founder 10 uninterrupted minutes at Sunday dinner. My father beamed and raised his glass of red wine. "That is exactly what I like to hear, son. It takes a real man to build an empire from scratch. You remind me of myself at your age, taking risks and providing for your family the right way." Abigail laughed and set her new Prada bag on the table beside the gravy boat. Bradley surprised me with this yesterday after closing another software deal. He just makes things happen. Bradley smiled, but his phone vibrated against his thigh before the applause in Richard's voice had even faded. He glanced down, silenced it, and returned the device face down to his lap. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again. I had looked at Apex's public footprint before, mostly out of curiosity. The company's app rankings were weak, user reviews complained about broken features, and the hiring page had quietly removed several open positions that Bradley claimed he was desperate to fill. None of that proved a crisis, but it did not match the picture he was painting at the table. Then, his screen lit for a third time. I caught only a fragment of the caller name before he covered it with his hand. Collections. Bradley excused himself to refill his water, even though his glass was still half full. Richard never noticed. He was too busy praising the Prada bag as evidence that Abigail had married well. When Bradley returned, a darker patch of sweat had formed beneath his collar. He launched into another story about server expansion and a coming investment round, talking faster than before. The performance was so aggressive that I stopped hearing the claims and started noticing the gaps between them. Abigail used the next pause to announce that the vow renewal invitations were finally finished. She had chosen Pine Valley Country Club, ordered white orchids, booked a photographer, and invited several of Richard's banking friends because, as she put it, Bradley's next round is all about relationships. Richard loved the idea. He said a polished celebration reminded people that success was stable, not temporary. Bradley's smile tightened at the word stable. He asked what the final guest count was. Abigail said 120 and began listing upgrades she still wanted: a larger floral arch, a premium champagne package, and a second dessert station. "It is only our 5th anniversary once," she said. Bradley looked down at his phone again. Richard waved away Bradley's concern. "Spend the money. You cannot act nervous when you are building something big." Then he turned toward me. "You should pay attention to your sister. She understands that presentation creates opportunity." Abigail lifted her glass. "Maybe Sarah can help with setup. She has plenty of free time." Nobody asked whether I had plans. I said I would see what the week looked like. The conversation moved on, but Bradley's expression did not. The party Abigail described as proof of prosperity sounded to him like another bill arriving before Friday. I rested my hands in my lap. "I bought the sweater yesterday," I said. "It is comfortable for working from home." Richard scoffed. "Sitting on a laptop in your bedroom is not working, Sarah. You are 29 years old. You have no degree that matters and no drive. You float through life letting other people carry your weight. It is humiliating to explain you to my friends at the bank." Abigail smirked behind her wineglass. "You could at least dress up for church. Dad gives you this beautiful roof over your head, and you cannot even make an effort." Bradley laughed nervously and wiped his forehead with his napkin. "Come on, Abby. Not everyone is built for the fast-paced life. We cannot all be innovators." I looked around the table. The chandelier I had paid to repair, the property tax notice I had already cleared for the year, the groceries charged to a household account I replenished, the roof over all of us that was legally mine. Their version of reality had become so complete that none of them saw the contradiction. "You are right," I said. "I will try to do better." Richard grunted, disappointed that I had not given him an argument to win. "Saying you will do better is meaningless," Richard snapped. "Actions are what matter in this house. Since you do not contribute a single dime to the bills, you can start earning your keep right now. Wash every dish by hand. Do not put the good china in the dishwasher." Abigail stood, hooked her new Prada bag over her arm, and smiled as if she had just won something. "Make sure you scrub the roasting pan. The grease sticks in the corners." Bradley followed her out, still checking the phone that had buzzed through half of dinner. I carried the plates into the kitchen and ran hot water. Usually I could let the ritual pass without giving it much thought. That night, Bradley's behavior stayed in the back of my mind. I had heard plenty of founders exaggerate optimism, but his body language did not look like ordinary startup stress. He had been checking a phone he wanted nobody else to see, speaking too quickly, and watching Richard every time money came up. I worked through the china and serving dishes one by one, finished the roasting pan, wiped the counter, and reached behind the microwave for a dish towel that had slipped into the narrow gap. My fingers touched paper instead. I pulled out 3 thick envelopes that had been wedged flat between the appliance and the wall. Each one was addressed to me. The return address belonged to First National Trust, a local bank where I had never held an account. I set the envelopes on the dry counter and looked at them before opening anything. The top one referenced a new account disclosure. Another carried the words, "Property Secured Credit" near the window. The third used my full legal name with the middle initial that appeared on my driver's license, not the shortened version my family normally used. That detail made the stack feel deliberate. Someone had not guessed at my identity. Someone had worked from a document. The postmarks were recent, and none of the envelopes had been forwarded or misdelivered. They had come to this house and then been hidden in a place almost nobody touched except me. I thought back over the previous 2 weeks. Richard had volunteered several mornings to bring in the mail before breakfast. Once, Abigail had handed me a catalog and a utility flyer, but nothing financial. I had not noticed the pattern then, because there had been no reason to look for one. Now I had a reason. From the den came the television, Abigail laughing at something on the screen, and Richard telling someone that Bradley's company was about to break through. Bradley did not answer. A moment later, I heard his chair scrape across the floor, and his footsteps moved down the hallway. I picked up the envelopes and followed at a distance, intending to ask Richard why correspondence from a bank I did not use had been hidden behind the microwave. The oak door to his home office was closed. A strip of light showed beneath it. Before I knocked, Bradley's voice came through the wood, low and stripped of the confidence he had worn at dinner. "Richard, you do not understand. The vendors are cutting off our server access on Wednesday. The venture capital guys backed out 3 weeks ago. I am tapped out. My credit cards are maxed, and the business accounts are overdrawn by $40,000. If I do not have a massive cash injection by Friday, I have to file for Chapter 11. The entire firm is going under." My hand stayed beside the door. 20 minutes earlier, he had been describing investors who were supposedly competing to fund his expansion. Now he sounded like a man counting hours. Richard answered in a hiss. "Keep your voice down. Do you want Abigail to hear you? Do you want the neighborhood to know you are failing?" The hidden envelopes and Bradley's panic suddenly belonged to the same story. I lowered my hand and listened. I did not need to invent a theory yet. I needed to hear what they believed they were hiding. "I do not care who hears me at this point," Bradley fired back, though his voice remained a desperate whisper. "Richard, I am out of time. Abigail thinks we are buying a vacation home in Aspen next year. She just put $10,000 on her credit card for a vow renewal caterer because she thinks we are swimming in cash. You promised me the bailout funds would be ready by this weekend. You promised me you had this handled. If that money does not hit my operating account by Friday morning, they lock the doors and seize the equipment. Everything I have built is gone." I pressed my shoulder against the wall, holding my breath. The pieces were shifting, aligning into a picture that made my stomach twist. My father did not have cash. I knew exactly what my father had. He had a modest pension, a mountain of luxury car leases, and country club dues that he struggled to pay. He relied on me, blindly believing I was using a generic property management company to cover the bills for the house. He did not have the capital to bail out a failing tech startup. "You need to calm down and act like a man," my father snapped. I could hear his heavy footsteps pacing the floorboards inside the office. "Panic is for amateurs, Bradley. I told you I would handle the cash flow problem, and I did. You just have to follow the timeline and keep your mouth shut." "But how?" Bradley pleaded. "How did you get that kind of liquid cash? You told me your bank denied the commercial loan application last month because you did not have sufficient collateral." I leaned closer to the heavy wooden door, the grain pressing into my cheek. The hallway was silent, amplifying the desperate argument happening just inches away. I pictured Bradley in there, sweating through his expensive church suit, pacing nervously while my father sat behind his massive mahogany desk. My father loved that desk. He loved playing the role of the wealthy patriarch, dispensing wisdom and favors to his chosen inner circle. I had always known his wealth was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion funded by my silent financial support. But I had never realized how far he would go to maintain that illusion. "Richard, please," Bradley's voice cracked. "If you pulled strings at the bank, if you did something illegal, they will audit my firm. I cannot survive an audit right now. My books are a mess. We have been inflating our active user metrics for 6 months just to keep the current investors from pulling their equity. If a forensic accountant looks at my ledgers, I am not just looking at bankruptcy. I am looking at federal wire fraud." My heart hammered against my ribs. Wire fraud, falsified user metrics. Bradley was not just a terrible businessman. He was actively committing corporate fraud. And my sister, the golden child with her expensive Italian leather handbags, was spending stolen money. I gripped the unopened envelope so tightly the thick paper crinkled in my hand. I spent my days tearing apart shell companies and tracing hidden assets for high-stakes corporate litigation. Hearing Bradley confess to the exact financial crimes I investigated for a living was surreal. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash inside my own home. "Nobody is going to audit you," my father said, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "You are overthinking this, Bradley. You came to me for help because I am a senior vice president. I know how the banking system works. I know how to bypass the red tape. I did not pull strings at my bank. I went to a different institution, First National Trust. They are a local branch. They approve loans in-house. The manager there is a guy I play golf with. He owes me a few favors from the old days." He pushed the paperwork through without asking too many questions. First National Trust, the exact name printed on the envelopes in my hand. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I looked down at the letters. They were addressed to Sarah, not Richard. If my father had taken out a loan with his golf buddy, my name should never have been involved. "But what kind of loan?" Bradley asked, sounding marginally less frantic but still deeply suspicious. "You cannot just magically produce that kind of capital without tying it to a hard asset. What did you use for leverage?" That is the moment the world stopped spinning. That is the moment the ground vanished beneath my feet. "I used the house," my father said casually. The silence that followed was absolute. I stopped breathing. I stared at the closed door, my mind racing through the legal implications, the banking regulations, the sheer impossibility of what he had just confessed. My father did not own the house. My grandmother had left the estate to me. My name was the only name on the deed. My name was the only one on the title. It was legally impossible for Richard to use the property as collateral unless he had done something unspeakable. "You used this house?" Bradley asked, his voice hushed with shock. "Richard, you told me last year that your mother left the deed to Sarah. You told me Sarah owns the estate." "Yes, she does," my father replied, his tone dismissive and cold. "But the $250,000 equity loan cleared this morning. Sarah is too stupid to ever check the title on the house. She thinks I still own it." I stood frozen in the dark hallway. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A $250,000 equity loan, $250,000 leveraged against my property, my safety net, my inheritance. "How did you get a home equity loan approved without her signature?" Bradley asked, his panic rising again to a fever pitch. "Richard, you cannot borrow against a house you do not own. If the bank finds out, they will call the loan immediately. That is real estate fraud. That is identity theft. It is only fraud if someone reports it," my father scoffed, "and nobody is going to report it. Sarah has no idea how real estate works. She sits in her bedroom all day in sweatpants typing on her little laptop. She does not know what a home equity line of credit is. She thinks a title is just something on the front of a book." My father laughed, a dry, cruel sound that echoed in the quiet room. "I had my friend at the bank generate the loan paperwork," my father continued. "I brought the documents home. I forged Sarah's signature on the borrower line. It was easy. Her handwriting is basically just print anyway. Then I took the documents to Jim, that notary public from our church congregation. I told him Sarah was sick and could not leave the house, but that she had signed it in front of me. Jim trusts me implicitly. He stamped it, notarized it, and I handed it back to the bank. The funds hit the joint account at noon today. I will wire the entire $250,000 to your business account tomorrow morning. You forged her signature." Bradley sounded horrified. "Richard, if she ever tries to sell the house, or if she pulls her credit report, she will see a massive lien on the property. She will see $250,000 in debt that she never agreed to. She is never going to sell the house," my father said impatiently. "Where would she go? She has no real job. She relies on me to provide for her. By the time she ever figures it out, if she ever figures it out, your tech company will be publicly traded. You will pay off the equity loan, I will close the account, and Sarah will never even know it happened. It is a victimless crime, Bradley. I am saving your business. I am saving Abigail's lifestyle. Sarah is finally contributing to this family, even if she does not know it." I stood in the hallway, the unopened mail trembling in my hands. The envelopes from First National Trust were not credit card offers. They were not junk mail. They were the loan approval documents. They were the truth, hidden right in my own kitchen, deliberately intercepted before I could see them. For several seconds, I could only stare at the office door. Richard had used the home my grandmother left me as collateral, and Bradley had known enough about the ownership to understand exactly why a forged signature was necessary. The insult at dinner suddenly seemed trivial beside that fact. I had paid the taxes, repairs, insurance, and emergencies for years, while Richard enjoyed the appearance of being the provider. His answer to that generosity was to treat my identity as another family asset he could spend. I wanted to open the door and force both men to repeat every word to my face. That would have given me a moment of satisfaction and given them the one thing they desperately needed: warning. Instead, I stepped away. The useful part of the conversation was not how vicious it sounded, it was how specific it had been. First National Trust, $250,000, Jim's notary seal, a transfer to Bradley's company the next morning. Those details could be checked. The argument had turned a suspicion into a map. The hardest realization was not that Richard needed money. I had known for years that his lifestyle was more fragile than it looked. It was that he had chosen my ignorance as part of the financing plan. The loan only worked if I remained the daughter who never checked records, never asked questions, and accepted whatever explanation he gave me. Bradley had questioned the forgery because he understood the risk, yet he had still been willing to take the money. Their confidence depended on a version of me they had invented together. That thought hurt, but it also simplified the next decision. I could not argue them into respecting me. I could only stop giving their assumptions access to my property. I looked once toward the office door and understood that opening it would turn a financial crime into a family argument. Richard knew how to win family arguments because he controlled the volume, the history, and the shame. He did not control the county recorder, the bank's audit trail, or the documents created by his own choices. Those were the places I needed to go next. First, he had left the bank correspondence in the kitchen. Second, he had confessed to the entire scheme out loud, detailing exactly who had notarized the forged documents and where the money was being wired. And third, he had drastically underestimated the woman standing on the other side of the door. I backed away from the office, my socks gliding silently over the hardwood floor. I retreated down the hallway, slipped into my bedroom, and locked the door behind me with a quiet click. I turned on my desk lamp and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I placed the unopened envelopes from First National Trust on my desk. I did not need to open them to know what they said. I needed to act. I opened my laptop, the same laptop my father had just mocked, and connected to my secure virtual private network. My hands were no longer shaking. My breathing was controlled. I logged directly into the major credit bureaus and pulled my comprehensive credit file. It took less than 30 seconds. There it was. A brand new massive trade line reported just this morning. First National Trust, home equity line of credit. Balance, $250,000. Status, active. I stared at the glowing screen, the cold, hard numbers confirming the ultimate betrayal. My father had anchored a massive financial weight to my neck. If Bradley's company went bankrupt, which it would, the bank would foreclose on my grandmother's house to recover the debt. My father had risked my home, my credit, and my entire future just to keep Abigail in designer bags and Bradley out of bankruptcy court. In my bedroom, I opened an encrypted file and titled it, Richard and Bradley. I wrote down the conversation while it was still fresh, separating what I had heard directly from what I only suspected. Sunday dinner, hidden mail, Bradley's bankruptcy warning, First National Trust, the forged signature, the notary, the planned transfer to Apex. I photographed the envelopes with their postmarks visible and saved the images with timestamps. Then I opened the county recorder's public portal and searched the parcel number for my grandmother's estate. A loading icon spun for a few seconds. I found myself hoping that Richard had been lying to Bradley, inventing a rescue plan to keep him quiet. The search result ended that hope. A new filing had been recorded against my property the previous morning. I downloaded the document, saved a clean copy, and printed one for a physical file. The question in my mind was no longer why my father could betray me. That answer could wait. What mattered now was how far the transaction had already traveled and who had touched it along the way. There was a brand new filing listed under my property index. The recording date stamp read yesterday morning. I clicked on the document icon and a scanned PDF of a legal instrument filled my screen. It was a deed of trust, securing a home equity line of credit. The lender was explicitly listed as First National Trust. The borrower listed was Sarah, my name. The property pledged as collateral was my 4-bedroom colonial house. The principal amount of the loan was $250,000. I scrolled down to the final signature page. There it was, my name, signed in blue ink on the borrower line. It was a surprisingly decent forgery, carefully mimicking the blocky, print-like style I used on personal checks. But it lacked the slight leftward slant I always used on the letter A. My father had clearly practiced it. Beside the forged signature was the official black ink of a notary seal. James Miller, Notary Public. Jim, from our church congregation, the man who handed out worship programs every Sunday morning and smiled at me warmly while asking how my week was going. He had stamped and validated a fraudulent legal document simply because my father, a senior bank vice president, had asked him to do it. He had legally testified that I was present in the room signing that paper, when I was actually sitting in my home office working on an audit. I pressed the print button. The laser printer in the corner of my bedroom whirred to life, spitting out 10 pages of physical proof documenting my father's felony. I gathered the warm papers and placed them carefully into a thick red folder. But I was not finished. A deed of trust only proved the lien existed. I needed to see the impact on my personal financial profile. The county record proved that the lien existed. The credit reports showed the same obligation from another angle. First National Trust had made a hard inquiry 2 weeks earlier and opened a revolving home equity account in my name with a limit of $250,000. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, changed the passwords on every financial account and email address connected to my identity, and enabled new alerts wherever they were available. Then I scanned the deed, the recorded lien, and the unopened bank correspondence into an encrypted folder and backed the files up separately. I also wrote a short contemporaneous memo of what I had heard outside Richard's office, distinguishing his exact words from what I inferred. That habit came from work, but I did not need to remind myself of my job title to understand why it mattered. Memory changes under stress. A dated record does not. By 2 a.m, the problem was defined. What I had were public records and my own credit file. What I still needed was the bank's origination package, the application, identification image, notary information, disbursement instructions, and transaction history. I placed my driver's license, social security card, original deed, printed county record, and professional credentials in a briefcase by the door. Sleep came in short fragments. At 7:30, I went downstairs. Richard sat at the kitchen island reading the financial pages as if the previous night had never happened. Bradley stood beside the toaster staring at his phone. Neither man knew I had spent the night securing my identity and documenting the lien they believed I would never notice. I walked past them, took my car keys from the hook by the door and said, "I have some errands to run. I will be out for a while." My father scoffed without looking up from his newspaper. "Try to do something productive today, Sarah. Sitting around the house all day is bad for your character." I walked out the front door, climbed into my reliable sedan, and drove straight out of the neighborhood. I did not drive toward a grocery store or a coffee shop. I drove directly to the main branch of First National Trust, located downtown. I pulled into the parking lot precisely at 8:55, waiting for the heavy glass doors to unlock at 9 o'clock. My professional briefcase sat on the passenger seat beside me. Inside, it was the red folder containing my grandmother's original deed, my unblemished driver's license, my social security card, and my credentials as a certified forensic auditor. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked through the doors. The bank was quiet, smelling of polished floor wax and fresh paper. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly to the reception desk for the commercial and mortgage lending department. A young woman in a neat blue suit looked up and smiled. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "I need to speak with the branch manager immediately," I said, keeping my voice polite but carrying an undertone of absolute authority. "It regards a fraudulent loan originated at this branch yesterday under my name." The receptionist's smile faltered. Her eyes widened slightly. "I am sorry. Did you say fraudulent?" At exactly 9, I walked through the glass doors of First National Trust with my deed, identification, credit report, and the printed county filing in my briefcase. The lobby had barely opened. Tellers were still arranging drawers, and the coffee station had not finished brewing. I went directly to the reception desk for mortgage and commercial lending. "I need the branch manager," I said. A $250,000 home equity line was opened against my property without my consent or signature. The receptionist's practiced smile disappeared. She asked whether I was reporting identity theft. Yes. 10 minutes later, I was inside a glass-walled office across from David Mercer, the senior branch manager. He pulled up the file while I placed my driver's license and deed on his desk. The digital record listed me as borrower and showed a notarized deed of trust. "The loan officer was Michael Torres," David said carefully. "The file contains a signed application and identification." I handed him my professional credentials. "I investigate financial fraud for a living. The signature is not mine. I was not present for a closing, and Richard Cole had no authority to pledge this property." David's expression changed from skepticism to alarm. He enlarged the scanned signature, then checked the ownership record I had brought. "If you are correct, we have an origination problem and an identity verification problem," he said. "I need legal and compliance involved now." "Good," I replied, "and before anyone calls my father as a courtesy, preserve the file exactly as it exists." "Preserve everything," I said. "Do not alter a document, delete a note, or warn Richard Cole. Before any formal dispute changes the account status, I need a complete copy of the origination file in my name. the application, the identification used, the notary information, the disbursement instructions, and the transfer records. My attorney will deliver the fraud notice and freeze request through the proper channel. David hesitated only long enough to call the bank's internal legal desk. After confirming my identity and status as the named borrower and property owner, he was authorized to provide copies of the documents attached to the disputed account and to place a preservation flag on the file. He turned to his computer and began printing. The first pages showed the forged application and an expired copy of my driver's license. The last pages showed the disbursement instruction directing the HELOC draw to an account that would then send the money to Apex Tech Solutions, Bradley's LLC. The transfer was scheduled to post at noon. I stayed while the bank's compliance desk verified the transaction history. At noon, the $250,000 draw posted, and the outbound wire to Apex Tech Solutions cleared. David printed the transaction confirmation and added it to my file. The money had now traveled exactly where Richard and Bradley intended it to go. The record was no longer a plan. It was a completed financial trail. I reviewed every page before placing the stack in my red folder. The forged signature, the false notarization, the HELOC lien, and the completed wire all pointed in the same direction. I asked David to preserve the records, prohibit any additional advances while counsel reviewed the fraud, and direct all further communication through the bank's compliance department. I did not ask him to erase what had happened. I needed the transaction history intact. David scrolled through the electronic activity log while we waited for compliance. The application had been entered by Michael Torres, the loan officer Richard had apparently approached through his social connection. There was no video verification attached to the file, and no record of me logging into an online portal to approve the transaction. The scanned identification was old enough that the address line had been updated elsewhere in the bank's system, but not on the image itself. None of those details proved intent by themselves, but together they explained how a bad file had moved too far without someone stopping it. David printed the audit trail and added it to the packet. "This should have triggered a second review," he said quietly. I did not answer. His own compliance team could decide which internal controls had failed. My concern was preserving the evidence before anyone who knew Richard had time to clean up a note, revise a comment, or explain away an exception. David called the bank's compliance counsel while I remained in his office. A few minutes later, an attorney from headquarters joined us by video and asked me to verify my identity, the property address, and whether I had ever granted Richard a power of attorney. I had not. She asked me to sign my name 3 times on a blank page while David watched. Then, place those signatures beside the one in the loan file. The forgery copied the broad shape and missed the small habits a person develops over years. Next, she asked where I had been on the date the notary claimed I appeared. I opened my work calendar. That afternoon, I had been in a recorded client meeting from home with 6 other people. My employer could confirm the login and meeting metadata if investigators requested it. David then pulled the transaction detail onto his screen. The draw had posted to the HELOC, moved through the bank's settlement process, and cleared to Apex Tech Solutions shortly before I arrived. The receiving account name matched Bradley's company exactly. The attorney explained that the bank would open a formal identity theft and origination review, restrict new draws and changes to the line, and preserve the electronic file. She was careful not to promise that the completed transfer could simply be reversed. Funds already sent to a business account required a separate recovery process, especially if the recipient had begun spending them. That was frustrating, but it also clarified the case. The house needed to be protected, the lien challenged, and the transfer traced. David printed the documents I was entitled to receive as the named borrower and property owner, the application, identification image, notarized deed of trust, disbursement instructions, and transfer record. An expired copy of my driver's license had been used. Jim's seal appeared beside a statement claiming I had acknowledged the documents in person. The transfer authorization led straight to Apex. I asked for a written acknowledgement that the dispute had been received and that underwriting notes, call logs, identification images, and original electronic records would be retained. The compliance attorney gave me a case number and a direct contact. Only then did I leave. In the parking lot, I scanned every page into an encrypted folder before starting my car. I now had a clean path from my property to Bradley's business, supported by records created by the people who thought I would never ask for them. Before I left First National Trust, the compliance attorney asked David to walk through the origination log one more time while she remained on the video call. The timestamps mattered. The application had been created under loan officer Michael Torres's credentials. An identification image had been uploaded minutes later. The notary acknowledgement was scanned the following day, and the account moved to funding without any record of a live video verification or electronic approval from me. David did not speculate about why those controls had been skipped. He simply read the log and preserved it. The attorney told him to lock the internal comments so later users could add notes without overwriting the original entries. That detail reassured me more than an apology would have. I did not need the bank to tell me it was sorry before it knew what happened. I needed it to keep the evidence from changing. David asked whether I wanted to speak with Michael Torres if he was available. The compliance attorney immediately said no. Not informally, she said. If there is an identity theft allegation, the employee interview belongs to the investigation. I agreed. Confronting a loan officer in a glass office might have felt satisfying for 5 minutes and damaged the clarity of everything that followed. Instead, I requested a certified copy of the bank's written acknowledgement of my dispute and the direct contact for its fraud team. David printed both. He looked exhausted by then. I have known Richard professionally for years, he said quietly. I did not know he had any connection to this account until you walked in. I believed that he believed it. Whether other employees had known more was not my problem to decide that morning. The final question from compliance concerned the outgoing transfer. The $250,000 had already reached Apex. If the receiving bank still held the funds untouched, a recall request might recover some of it. If the company had begun spending, recovery would become more complicated. I authorized the bank to pursue whatever recall and interbank procedures were appropriate, without representing that the transfer had been mine. David submitted the request while I watched. No one promised success. That distinction kept the chronology clean. The fraudulent loan had funded, the money had moved, I had reported it, and the bank was now trying to contain further damage. I left with documents rather than assurances, which was exactly what I wanted. I did not drive directly from the bank to Robert's office. First, I stopped at the county recorder's public counter and requested certified copies of the deed and the newly recorded lien. I already had digital versions, but Robert had told me that when ownership itself might become the subject of a family argument, certified records were worth the extra half hour. The clerk behind the counter did not know anything about my family. She entered the parcel number, printed the index, and asked whether I wanted both instruments certified. Yes, I said. She stamped the copies, attached the certification pages, and slid them under the glass. The ordinary nature of the transaction steadied me. There was no debate about who owned the house. The county system showed the deed in my name, recorded years before the HELOC. Richard's confidence did not appear anywhere in that chain of title. In the parking garage, I spread the certified deed, lien, bank acknowledgement, and transfer record across the passenger seat before putting them into the red folder. For the first time since the hallway conversation, the case existed outside my memory as a complete sequence of independent records. My grandmother's deed came first, then the recent lien, then the bank file showing the application and notary acknowledgement, then the transfer to Apex. I photographed the certification pages and sent them to Robert's secure intake address. He called while I was still in the car. "Good," he said after checking the images. Bring the originals. We are going to separate two questions. First, how do we protect your title and challenge the lien? Second, what can be done about money that has already reached a company in distress? He paused. Do not combine them just because the same people are involved. That instruction became the organizing rule for everything that followed. Before I pulled out of the garage, I called the title insurance contact listed in my closing file and reported that a disputed lien had appeared against the property. I did not ask the representative to decide who was guilty. I asked what notice they needed so no future request involving the parcel would move forward without review. She gave me a claim reference number and asked for the certified deed, the disputed instrument, and the bank case number. I sent the documents from my phone, then wrote the new reference number on the front of the red folder. It was another small layer of protection, separate from the bank and separate from the police. By the time I started the car, 4 independent systems now reflected the dispute: the credit bureaus, First National Trust, the county record I had copied, and the title insurer. Richard had built his plan on the assumption that I would remain unaware. Awareness, once documented in the right places, changed the entire risk. 45 minutes after leaving the bank, I was in Robert Hayes' conference room with the red folder open between us. Robert handled real estate fraud, creditor disputes, and asset recovery, which meant I did not have to translate the significance of what the bank had given me. He read the deed, the application, the notary page, and the transfer record in silence. "This is serious," he said at last. "If the facts hold, there are potential identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy issues. But we do not predict charges or sentences from a conference room. We preserve evidence, notify the right parties, protect the property, and let investigators decide the criminal side." That was the answer I wanted. I told him the $250,000 had already cleared into Apex Tech Solutions and that Bradley's company appeared to be near insolvency. "Then there are 2 emergencies," Robert said. "The first is your title and the fraudulent lien. The second is what happens to the proceeds now that they have reached a failing company." I asked him to trace Bradley's creditor structure before we made any move that would give the family time to scatter assets. Robert pulled a legal pad toward him. "We can do that, but every step stays clean. No hacking, no false pretenses, no pretending a civil creditor has powers it does not have." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated across the glass table. Abigail's name appeared on the screen. She wanted $5,000 for the vow renewal caterer because Bradley's business cards were temporarily frozen. Robert looked at the message, then at me. "Your timing is remarkable." "So is theirs," I said. I stared at the glowing words. A vow renewal. Abigail and Bradley had been married for exactly 5 years. They were planning a lavish, expensive catered party at a local country club to celebrate a marriage built on stolen money and desperate lies. I watched the 3 little gray dots appear on the screen as Abigail began typing again. "Do not tell me you do not have the money," Abigail's next message demanded. "I know you do not pay rent. Dad provides that beautiful house for you to live in free of charge. You eat our food and you use our utilities. Sending me this cash is the absolute least you can do to earn your keep around here." I read the words twice to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. My sister, who was currently married to a man attempting to steal $250,000 from my personal property, was demanding I pay for her luxury catering out of a twisted sense of obligation. She actually believed I was an unemployed freeloader. She actually believed she was entitled to my savings. I kept a spreadsheet of every dollar I had ever spent on this family over the years, tracking the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and the maintenance bills. And I never expected to be called a burden by the people I had been carrying for almost a decade. Robert was watching my face closely across the conference table. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone shifting into protective legal counsel mode. I set the phone face up on the table. "Everything is fine," I said. My sister just reminded me how entitled they feel to anything connected to me. We will report the identity theft through the proper channels. First, I want to secure the civil side so Bradley cannot move assets the moment he realizes the loan is being challenged. Robert folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward. "I am listening," he said. "What exactly do you want to do?" "I want to legally buy Bradley's corporate debt," I said smoothly. I picked up my phone and typed a polite, cheerful reply to Abigail. I told her I had scraped together some savings from my online data entry jobs, and that I would be happy to help her out for her special day. I told her I would send the $5,000 directly to the catering company, so she would not have to worry about the bank error. She replied immediately, with a simple thumbs-up emoji. There was no thank you message. There was no expression of gratitude. It was just a casual digital acknowledgement that the family ATM had dispensed the requested cash on demand. I opened my professional laptop right there in the conference room. I logged into the secure banking portal for my corporate holding company, a holding company I used for legitimate business activity. I initiated a direct wire transfer of $5,000 to Abigail's luxury caterer. I smiled as the green confirmation screen popped up. I was not giving my sister a generous gift. I was secretly purchasing my front row ticket to the exact event where I planned to dismantle their stolen lives. Robert watched my fingers fly across the keyboard. "You just paid for her party," he noted, sounding slightly confused by my actions. "I bought the stage for the grand finale," I corrected him, closing the banking tab. "But that is just the catering deposit. Now, I need your law firm to help me acquire the actual prize." I turned my laptop toward Robert and opened the public filings for Apex Tech Solutions. Bradley was weeks from insolvency. Vendors had issued default notices, his cards were maxed out, and his primary commercial lender had declared a $150,000 note in default. Unlike the scattered vendor balances, that note carried a first-priority security interest in the company's equipment, receivables, and other business assets under a filed financing statement. The lender specialized in high-risk startup credit and was already trying to exit the position. A deeply distressed note could be sold at a steep discount, but the assignment would carry the lender's contractual rights and its existing security interest. That was the leverage I needed. Not a magic power to seize a company overnight, but a lawful position from which my LLC could demand payment, preserve collateral, and ask a court to enforce the default if Bradley refused. "I want your firm to approach the lender as broker for my holding company," I told Robert. "Offer $30,000 for the defaulted note and all associated security rights. Bradley does not need to know that I control the purchasing LLC until the assignment is complete." Robert studied the filing and nodded. "If the lender accepts and the assignment is valid, your LLC steps into its position. You can issue a formal demand for the overdue balance, require preservation of the pledged assets, and seek judicial enforcement if he keeps defaulting or tries to hide collateral. It also puts you first in line on the assets covered by that lien." Robert made me slow down before we contacted the lender. "Buying a defaulted note is not a magic trick," he said. "If your company acquires it, you acquire a claim and the contractual rights that come with it. You do not instantly own Bradley's office, bank account, or equipment. If Apex refuses to cure the default, we enforce the agreement through the remedies it already contains, and, if necessary, through court." That was exactly how I wanted it handled. The commercial lender had already issued default notices on a $150,000 note and was tired of chasing a startup that missed payments while promising new funding. Robert called the lender's workout department with me in the room. The representative described months of failed promises, an abandoned restructuring proposal, and collateral reports that had not been updated on schedule. The lender was willing to sell the distressed note at a discount rather than spend more money collecting it. My holding company made the offer through counsel. The assignment package included the balance, prior notices, a schedule of pledged business equipment, and the clauses governing default. Robert walked me through every page. Nobody forged a signature. Nobody called a golf friend. Nobody asked a notary to pretend I had appeared somewhere I had not. The transaction was ordinary, documented, and enforceable. My company wired the purchase price into escrow, the lender executed the assignment, and Robert's firm prepared notice to Apex, identifying the new creditor without naming me personally. When the confirmation arrived, he set it beside the HELOC file. "Keep these two tracks separate," he said. "Your father's HELOC is an illegitimate obligation against your property. Bradley's commercial note is a legitimate obligation his company already owes. We challenge one and enforce the other." I understood. Their connection was not legal, it was strategic. Richard had moved stolen equity into a company already drowning in valid debt. Owning that debt gave me leverage over Bradley's business, without touching the fraud case or inventing a shortcut of my own. Before Robert let the purchase close, he made me review the creditor file as if the debtor were a stranger. That mattered. Anger could not be the reason an assignment was valid. The original lender produced the signed note, payment history, default notices, and the financing statement covering specific business equipment and receivables. We checked that the filing was still effective, that no later amendment had released the collateral, and that the lender actually had the right to assign the note. Robert's associate compared the asset schedule with public filings and the information Apex had given its lender. Several pieces of server equipment were listed at values that looked optimistic, but the legal point was simpler. The security interest existed before I entered the picture. I was not creating a claim against Bradley because he had harmed me. My company was buying an existing claim that his company had already failed to pay. The lender's workout officer joined a call and described months of missed deadlines. Bradley had promised a bridge round, then a strategic investor, then a large client contract. Each promise had arrived just before another payment date and disappeared just after it. The lender no longer wanted to spend staff time on a small, distressed technology account. My offer through the holding company gave them a clean exit. Robert negotiated representations about the authenticity of the documents and required delivery of the complete servicing history before funds left escrow. I read every page. The contrast with Richard's HELOC scheme was almost absurd. Here, signatures were verified, rights were disclosed, money moved through escrow. Counsel documented who represented whom. Nobody needed a friendly notary, an old copy of someone else's driver's license, or a story about a sick borrower who could not appear. When the assignment was executed, Robert sent me the final package and made me read the default provisions again. The new creditor could issue a demand, require information the loan documents entitled it to receive, and pursue specified collateral if Apex did not cure. It could not walk into the office and start carrying computers away. It could not freeze personal accounts unrelated to the agreement. It could not skip court where court process was required. I appreciated the limits as much as the leverage. Richard had treated rules as obstacles to work around. I wanted the opposite. If Bradley's company collapsed, I wanted every consequence attached to an obligation he had knowingly signed. Not to some revenge device I invented after the fact. That same afternoon, Robert's firm received confirmation that the assignment had been recorded in the lender's servicing system. The notice to Apex would identify the new creditor by the holding company's legal name and payment address. My personal name did not need to appear. I asked Robert how long that anonymity could realistically last. "Not forever," he said. "If there is litigation, ownership can become discoverable. But secrecy is not the legal value here. The value is that the transaction is complete before Bradley can pressure the old lender to change its mind." That was enough. I was not trying to hide permanently. I only wanted the debt purchase finished before the family understood that the person they dismissed as financially helpless had become part of Bradley's creditor structure. Over the next several days, the change in Bradley was easier to see because nobody in the family knew I had any reason to watch him. He stopped talking about expansion at breakfast and started taking calls in the garage. A courier envelope from his former lender arrived Tuesday afternoon. He carried it upstairs without opening it in front of Abigail. Richard drove twice to First National Trust and came home furious that new compliance people were making routine banking impossible. He never asked me whether I had spoken to the bank. The possibility did not occur to him. In his mind, I still did not understand the difference between a mortgage and a title. That arrogance gave Robert and me room to work through ordinary channels, while the household blamed every problem on bad luck. Abigail, meanwhile, treated the vow renewal as if no financial crisis existed. The dining table disappeared beneath sample menus, place cards, flower photographs, and seating charts. She argued with a florist about imported orchids, complained about the venue's service charge, and asked me to pick up dry cleaning because she was overwhelmed. Richard encouraged every upgrade because several guests at the vow renewal would also attend his retirement gala. People remember presentation, he told her. You never look cheap in front of people who can open doors for you. Bradley heard him from the doorway and closed his eyes for a second before walking outside to answer another call. One evening, I passed the den and heard Bradley ask whether First National Trust had fixed the restriction. Richard said his contact was working on it, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried in the office hallway. The $250,000 had reached apex, but it was already being consumed by overdue payroll, vendors, taxes, hosting charges, and the other obligations Bradley had postponed while waiting for rescue. The transfer bought time. It did not repair the company. My holding company now owned a valid defaulted note that Apex still could not cure. That was enough. I did not need to invent a trap or interfere with operations. I only needed to let a real debt reach its real deadline. I answered work emails from the kitchen counter while Abigail walked past asking whether I could collect her shoes from the tailor. A message from Robert would arrive about the assignment. I would review it in plain sight, and the family would assume I was doing trivial freelance work. The misunderstanding they had used to insult me now protected the distance between my personal identity and the creditor Bradley feared. By Friday, Robert confirmed that the formal demand package was ready for service after the vow renewal. The timing mattered less for spectacle than for preservation. Bradley would receive a clear notice, a defined cure period, and a warning not to move pledged assets. If pressure made him reveal something useful before then, we would document it. If not, the contract would still proceed on its own terms. I went to the vow renewal knowing exactly which pieces were already facts and which still required proof. The night before the vow renewal, Abigail turned the upstairs hallway into a staging area for garment bags, shoe boxes, and flower samples. She had spent the week behaving as if the party itself could force reality back into place. When I came downstairs after finishing a client call, she was standing in front of the entry mirror holding 2 necklaces against her dress. "You are still coming tomorrow, right?" she asked. I said I would. She gave me a quick look from head to toe. "Wear something decent. Bradley has important people there, and Dad invited some of his banking friends. I do not want anyone thinking we let you show up looking like you are going grocery shopping." Richard, sitting in the living room with his phone on speaker, covered the microphone and nodded in agreement. "Your sister is right. This is a formal event." I almost laughed at the word let. The venue deposit had cleared from my account, the house around them belonged to me, and Bradley's new creditor was a company I controlled. Yet the family hierarchy remained untouched because none of those facts had entered their version of the world. "I have a black dress," I said. Abigail relaxed. "Fine, and do not be offended by the seating. We had to organize people by connection. Bradley's investors and Dad's colleagues need to be close to the front." "I will sit wherever my name is." She smiled as if I had finally learned my place and returned to her jewelry. Across the room, Richard resumed his call. He was speaking to someone at First National Trust, insisting that a security restriction had to be a misunderstanding. The person on the other end said something I could not hear. Richard's face tightened. "I have been in banking for 35 years, he said. "Do not quote policy to me." The call ended less than a minute later. He stared at the phone and then blamed the problem on young compliance employees who did not understand relationships. Bradley came in through the garage while Richard was still complaining. He looked exhausted. His tie was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. Abigail immediately asked whether he had confirmed the photographer's final payment. Bradley said yes, without checking anything. Then he noticed me near the stairs and gave me a distracted nod. For a second, I wondered whether he had any idea how much I knew. He did not. His attention moved back to Richard. "Did they release the rest of the line?" "No," Richard said, "but they will." Bradley rubbed both hands over his face. "We do not have time for will." Abigail snapped that they were not discussing business the night before her renewal ceremony and ordered both men to stop bringing bad energy into the house. Bradley looked at her as if he wanted to tell her everything. Instead, he picked up one of the flower invoices, put it down again, and walked upstairs. A message from Robert arrived on my phone a few minutes later. The debt assignment was complete, the creditor file was preserved, and the formal demand would be ready on the schedule we had agreed. I read the message once and locked the screen. Nothing required a speech. The next evening, Abigail would celebrate a version of her marriage built on Bradley's invented success. I would attend, sit where she placed me, and watch what happened when the financial pressure he had hidden finally followed him into the room. Abigail was holding court near the center of the ballroom. She wore a fitted white designer gown that looked much more like a bridal dress than a simple 5-year vow renewal outfit. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back and touching the arms of the wealthy guests who stopped to congratulate her. Beside her stood Bradley, looking uncomfortable. He was sweating heavily through his custom-tailored tuxedo, his eyes constantly darting toward the main exit. My father, Richard, was in his element. He moved from table to table, shaking hands, patting shoulders, and accepting compliments as if he were the groom himself. I walked over to the seating chart, displayed on a heavy golden easel near the entrance. I traced my finger down the alphabetical list of attendees until I found my name, Sarah Cole, Table 19. I looked around the massive ballroom to locate my assignment. Tables 1 through 10 were situated around the polished wooden dance floor. Tables 11 through 15 were positioned near the open bar. I kept walking toward the back of the room, past the towering flower arrangements and the string quartet. Table 19 was shoved into the absolute darkest corner of the ballroom, positioned directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. At the entrance, Abigail greeted guests beneath a flower wall printed with her and Bradley's initials. When she saw me, she glanced first at my dress and then at the small clutch in my hand, apparently checking whether I had brought a gift. "Table 19, she said before I could ask. "We had to keep the better tables for Bradley's investors and Dad's friends." She pointed toward the back without lowering her voice. A woman beside her gave me an apologetic look. "Of course," I said. Abigail smiled, satisfied that I had accepted the slight. Then the catering director approached and quietly thanked me for arranging the final deposit. Abigail's head snapped around. "She means the family deposit," Abigail said quickly. The director looked confused but nodded and moved on. For the first time that evening, my sister studied me instead of dismissing me. I could almost see her trying to fit the payment into the story she had told herself about my finances. Bradley called her name from across the ballroom before she could ask. She turned away, and the question remained unanswered. I took my seat at the small table. I was surrounded by distant, elderly cousins and awkward +1s who barely spoke to one another. Every 2 minutes, a hurried waiter rushed past my chair, pushing the heavy wooden doors open. Each time, the doors flapped wildly, releasing a blast of hot air, the smell of industrial dish soap, and the loud clatter of pans. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. Abigail had intentionally placed me at the absolute worst table in the entire venue, ensuring I was seated far away from the important guests. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel like a complete afterthought. I sat straight in my chair, sipping a glass of iced water with lemon. The placement told me more about Abigail than it did about me. I felt like a silent architect admiring a building that was scheduled for demolition. Dinner service commenced. The waiters bumped the back of my chair no less than 5 times as they brought out the main courses. I ate my roasted tenderloin slowly, savoring the flavor of food funded by my own secret corporate account. I watched Abigail and Bradley eat at the head table. Abigail was glowing, holding her wine glass and smiling for the hired photographer. Bradley barely touched his food. He kept checking his phone under the table, his leg bouncing nervously. As the dessert plates were being cleared by the staff, the string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded as a sharp ringing sound echoed through the ballroom. Abigail was standing at the head table, tapping a heavy silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. "Thank you, everyone," Abigail announced, her voice amplified by the wireless microphone a waiter had quickly handed her. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate 5 incredible years of marriage." She beamed, looking out over the crowd of banking executives and country club members. When Bradley and I first met, I knew he was destined for greatness. Looking at him today, standing here as the founder of a booming technology firm, I could not be more proud. He is a brilliant genius, an innovator, and the absolute hardest-working man I know. A warm round of applause filled the room. Bradley offered a weak, trembling smile to the crowd. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Abigail turned her attention to our father, who was sitting proudly at the adjacent table. "And of course, we have to thank my amazing father, Richard. Dad, your extreme generosity knows no bounds. You have always provided the very best for us. You taught us what real success looks like, and you built a powerful legacy that Bradley and I are deeply honored to carry forward." My father stood up slightly, giving a humble, practiced wave to the clapping guests. I took another slow sip of my water, keeping my face expressionless. But Abigail was not finished speaking. She held the microphone closer to her mouth. Her eyes scanned the room, looking past the wealthy friends and the business partners until they locked onto me, sitting in the shadows by the kitchen doors. Her smile turned sharp, her voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "We are also so glad my little sister Sarah could make it," Abigail said, her tone turning sugary. "I know these country club events are a little outside your normal routine. It is nice of you to take a break from the laptop and join the real world." A few guests laughed. She kept going. "Family means supporting people, even when they have not quite figured out ambition yet. Dad has been incredibly patient about giving Sarah a place to live while she finds herself." More laughter followed, softer than Richard's later gala would produce, but pointed enough that several people turned to study me. The joke worked because everyone in the room had been given the same false premise. Richard owned the house, Bradley was prosperous, Abigail was generous, and I survived because they tolerated me. I lifted my water glass toward my sister, acknowledging the toast without rescuing her from the lie. Across the room, Bradley did not laugh. He stared at a new message on his phone and excused himself before the applause had finished. The toast ended to applause, and the band shifted into dance music. Guests moved toward the floor and open bar, while the catering staff cleared dessert plates through the swinging kitchen doors beside me. I stayed at table 19 for another minute and watched Bradley. He had been forcing smiles through the entire toast, but a message on his phone finally broke the performance. He read it once, then again. His jaw tightened. A guest beside him asked a question, and Bradley answered without looking up. Seconds later, he slipped the phone into his pocket and excused himself from the group. Richard noticed him leaving and started to follow, but Abigail caught her father by the sleeve because the photographer wanted another family picture. Bradley disappeared alone through the side corridor. I waited before standing. There was no reason to make my interest obvious. I told the elderly cousin beside me that I was going to get my shawl and walked away from the noise. The corridor was lined with dark wood paneling and old black and white photographs of golf champions. It led toward the restrooms, a small business lounge, and the guest coat room near the entrance. Bradley had chosen the one part of the club where he could make a call without music or relatives around him. As I approached the coat room, I heard his voice before I saw him. The confident founder from the ballroom was gone. "Listen to me," he said into the phone. "You do not understand how serious this is." I stopped just outside the doorway, close enough to hear and far enough that he could not see me from between the racks of coats. I stopped walking immediately. I pressed my back against the dark wood paneling just outside the coat room door. I held my breath, listening intently to the conversation. Bradley was pacing back and forth among the rows of heavy winter coats and formal suit jackets. I could hear the expensive fabric rustling loudly as he aggressively brushed past the racks, knocking a few wooden hangers to the floor in his panic. He was pacing furiously in tight circles. He was on his mobile phone, speaking to someone on the other end, and he sounded like a man standing on the very edge of a steep cliff. "I do not care what time it is," Bradley hissed into the phone, his voice echoing slightly in the small room. "You are my business partner. You need to fix this right now. The commercial lender sold our debt. Yes, the entire $150,000 default. Some anonymous holding company bought the debt yesterday afternoon, and they are not messing around. Their attorneys sent a formal demand letter to my business email 2 hours ago. They are calling the debt in full. They want immediate repayment by Monday morning, or they are filing for involuntary bankruptcy and seizing all the company assets." I stood still in the quiet hallway. My heart beat with a slow, powerful, and steady rhythm. The corporate trap Robert Hayes had set for me was working flawlessly. The steel jaws had snapped shut, and Bradley was finally feeling the sharp teeth. There was a brief pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. Bradley let out a strangled, desperate sound, forcefully smacking his hand against the wooden wall of the coat room. "No, I cannot pay the new creditor with Richard's bailout," Bradley snapped into the phone. "The $250,000 hit the company account, but it is already gone. Payroll took a chunk, the overdue hosting vendors took another, and the tax payment cleared yesterday. What is left is nowhere near enough to satisfy a $150,000 demand. Richard risked Sarah's house for money that bought me a few days, not a rescue." My professional instincts took over instantly. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen open, navigated quickly to the voice memo application, and pressed the red record button. I held the phone close to the edge of the doorway, making sure the microphone was angled to capture every single word echoing out of the coat room. "If this holding company pushes for enforcement, outside lawyers will start pulling our records," Bradley continued. "They will see the inflated user numbers and the false revenue reports. And if Sarah ever challenges that HELOC, the bank will trace the forged application straight back to Richard. He committed bank fraud to save us, and I knew where the money came from. If this unravels, both of us are finished." I watched the recording timer on my screen tick past 40 seconds. The audio was crystal clear. Bradley had just openly confessed to corporate fraud, falsified financial metrics, and his direct, explicit knowledge of my father's forged home equity loan. He had laid out the entire criminal conspiracy in plain English, unaware that the anonymous holding company destroying his life was currently standing 3 feet away, silently recording his full admission. "We have to hide the remaining server equipment tomorrow morning," Bradley whispered frantically, his voice dropping to a lower register. "Rent a commercial storage unit under your wife's maiden name. Move all the computers and the hard drives out of the office before Monday morning. I have to go back out there to the ballroom and smile at Abigail like we are not about to lose everything we have. Just do it." I heard the electronic beep of the call disconnecting. Bradley let out a long, ragged groan of defeat, followed by the sound of him kicking the wooden baseboard of the coat room wall. I gently pressed the stop button on my phone and saved the audio file directly to my secure cloud storage. I slipped the device back into my clutch, the soft click of the metal clasp echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. I did not wait for Bradley to emerge from the coat room. I turned and walked silently back down the carpeted hallway, my steps light, precise, and purposeful. When I re-entered the grand ballroom, the live music was blaring loudly. Abigail was in the center of the dance floor, twirling happily in her white gown, laughing with her wealthy friends. My father was standing at the crowded bar, ordering another expensive scotch, looking exactly like a king surveying his prosperous kingdom. They looked so confident, so deeply convinced of their own superiority and unbreakable status. I walked back to table 19, taking my seat next to the swinging kitchen doors. The elderly cousin sitting to my left, a woman wearing a heavy floral perfume, leaned over and patted my arm condescendingly. When I returned to table 19, an elderly cousin leaned toward me and offered the kind of sympathy that makes humiliation feel almost official. "Do not let Abigail bother you, dear. Maybe Bradley could find you a small job at his company." I thanked her and changed the subject. Under the table, I uploaded the coat room recording to encrypted storage and sent a copy to Robert with a single message. "Listen, from 0018. Bradley had confirmed 3 things we previously had only through documents and inference. He knew the HELOC was tied to my house. He knew Richard had arranged the forged paperwork, and he knew Apex's financial statements were false. He had also talked about moving equipment before a creditor could reach it. That last statement gave Robert something immediate to act on. The rest of the evening I watched the room differently. Abigail danced under the chandeliers in the gown she had bought for a celebration she could not afford. Richard accepted compliments about Bradley's future. Bradley moved from conversation to conversation, pretending to listen while checking his phone every few seconds. The 3 of them were still performing the same story, but only one of them knew how close it was to collapsing. Before I left, I passed the catering manager near the service doors. She thanked me for arranging the deposit so promptly. Abigail, standing 10 feet away, heard her and frowned. I smiled at the manager, wished her a good night, and kept walking. It was the first small crack in the family's assumption that money only flowed toward me, never from me. Near the end of the evening, Bradley returned to the ballroom with his tie loosened and his smile rebuilt. He moved directly to Abigail, kissed her cheek for the photographer, and posed beneath an arch of white flowers. The camera flash made the scene look flawless. Between photographs, he checked his phone. Richard joined them for a family picture and waved me over only after the photographer asked whether there were other immediate relatives present. Abigail's expression tightened. "Sarah hates pictures," she said. "She is fine where she is." The photographer glanced at me, embarrassed. I saved him from the argument and shook my head. That tiny exchange captured the family more accurately than any formal portrait could have. Their version of unity required me to remain outside the frame. 10 minutes later, I left through the lobby. Robert called before I reached my car. "I heard the recording," he said. His voice had lost its usual dry humor. "Do not contact Bradley about it. Do not send him a message. Do not hint that you heard him." I was not planning to. "Good. Tomorrow we preserve the corporate records and take the audio to the detective. The statement about moving equipment changes the urgency." I looked back through the country club windows. Abigail and Bradley were still dancing. Richard stood at the bar, accepting another handshake. "They think tonight went perfectly," I said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "Then let them think that until morning." The morning after the vow renewal, Robert listened to the coat room recording twice and marked only the portions that mattered. We did not need to turn every frightened sentence into a dramatic confession. One section tied Bradley directly to the HELOC against my house. Another acknowledged that Apex's reported performance did not match reality. The most urgent part was his instruction to move equipment before the new creditor could reach it. Robert stopped the audio there and called in one of his associates. Within minutes, preservation notices were being prepared for Apex's registered agent, the bank holding its operating account, and the storage vendor identified in the creditor file. The notices did not accuse anyone of a crime. They stated that records and identified collateral were relevant to an active dispute and should not be destroyed, concealed, or transferred outside ordinary business. It was not cinematic. It was useful. We then met with Detective Bennett from the Financial Crimes Unit. He approached the matter chronologically. When did I first see the bank envelopes? When did I overhear Richard and Bradley? Had I ever granted Richard a power of attorney? Had I ever authorized anyone to sign a loan against the property? Had I received any of the proceeds? Where was I when the notary claimed I had appeared? I gave in the deed, the bank packet, the transaction confirmation, and the unedited audio. My employer later supplied confirmation that I had been logged into a secure client meeting from home during the supposed notarization, along with meeting metadata that could be produced formally if investigators requested it. Bennett made no promises about arrests, charges, or timing. He said the evidence would be reviewed with prosecutors and that the bank's own internal inquiry would probably generate additional records. I signed the identity theft complaint and agreed not to contact the notary or loan officer myself. That was enough. I did not need the criminal process to move at the speed of my anger. From there, Robert separated the problem into 3 tracks on a yellow legal pad: the property fraud, Apex's legitimate commercial debt, and the criminal evidence. Under the first column were the deed, HELOC, signature, notary acknowledgement, and First National Trust file. Under the second were the assigned note, existing default, collateral schedule, and creditor remedies. Under the third were my complaint, Bradley's recording, and whatever investigators later obtained. "Do not let your father blur these together," Robert said. "Confusion helps him." We keep each claim attached to the document that supports it. Through counsel, I submitted the formal HELOC dispute and affidavit to First National Trust. The bank confirmed in writing that no additional draws, amendments, or transfers would be permitted while it investigated the origination and lien. The $250,000 already sent to Apex could not simply be reversed by pretending it had never moved, but the line was no longer an open source of cash, and the lien was formally contested. On the corporate side, Robert served Apex with the demand arising from the defaulted note my holding company had purchased. The letter stated the overdue balance, the cure period, the collateral covered by the existing security agreement, and the remedies already contained in the contract. It did not claim I owned Bradley's company or could empty his bank account on command. If Apex failed to cure, the creditor could pursue the collateral and ask a court to enforce the agreement. Bradley's lawyer called Robert before the end of the day. He wanted an extension and asked whether the new creditor would accept a restructuring proposal. Robert requested current financial statements, proof of available funds, a list of pledged assets, and confirmation that no collateral had been moved. The response told us more than a dramatic threat would have. Apex could not show enough liquidity to cure the default, and its equipment was worth far less than Bradley had implied in conversations with investors. The HELOC money had already been absorbed by overdue payroll, vendors, taxes, hosting charges, and other obligations Bradley had postponed while waiting for rescue. The $250,000 had bought time, not solvency. That evening, the house felt smaller than it ever had. Bradley paced in the kitchen while Abigail cried over a canceled purchase and demanded to know why he had become negative after their perfect party. Richard stood in his office arguing with First National Trust, repeatedly invoking his career and relationships as though the compliance department could be embarrassed into reopening a disputed credit line. I went upstairs and laid out the materials for his retirement gala: an emerald gown, my tablet, and a short presentation Robert had reviewed for accuracy. The slides were deliberately spare. The county deed established ownership. The disputed HELOC showed the unauthorized lien. The transfer record connected the proceeds to Apex. The assignment showed the creditor now holding Bradley's defaulted commercial debt. No adjectives, no claims about sentences, no attempt to turn the ballroom into a courtroom. Richard had chosen that room to celebrate the public version of himself. If he chose to define me there too, the people listening would finally have the records he had spent years assuming they would never see. The night before the gala, I was checking the presentation against the source files when the brass doorknob rattled. Richard used the emergency key before I could answer. He pushed the door open and stepped into my room with his phone clenched in one hand. His face was flushed, his collar damp. He had spent the day calling First National Trust, arguing with Bradley, and trying to understand why problems that once yielded to his name were suddenly being routed through compliance officers and attorneys. Unable to control the bank or the creditor pressing apex, he came upstairs looking for the person he still believed he could control. His eyes landed on the emerald gown across my bed. "What is that?" "My dress for tomorrow," I said. "It is your retirement party." He laughed without humor. "You think a dress changes who you are?" He stepped farther into the room. "Listen to me. I have banking colleagues coming tomorrow, people who matter. I am dealing with enough without you making a scene or talking about things you do not understand." He pointed toward the hallway, as if the ballroom were already on the other side of the door. "You sit in the back. You keep quiet. You do not corner my colleagues with stories about your internet jobs, and you do not embarrass Abigail or Bradley. Let the successful members of this family represent us for once." I looked at the man who had used my name on a loan and was still more afraid of embarrassment than consequences. "I understand." The answer satisfied him because he heard obedience in it. He warned me not to mention family money, complained that new compliance people at First National Trust were overreacting, and said Bradley only needed a few weeks for his company to stabilize. Then he left without closing the door. Downstairs, a cabinet slammed. Bradley was on another call, speaking in fragments about the cure deadline and a creditor he still could not identify. Abigail told him to keep his voice down because she needed sleep before the gala. I closed my door and packed one overnight bag into the trunk of my car. Robert had advised me not to return to the house alone immediately after any public confrontation. Then I tested the tablet and casting adapter once more. Every slide opened. Sensitive account digits were masked. Each document had a source copy stored with Robert. I had originally written explanatory captions beneath the images, but Robert had crossed out most of them. "Do not tell bankers what a deed is," he had said. "Show them the deed. Do not call someone a criminal before a court does. Show the record and state what you personally know." I followed that rule. The final presentation was shorter than the version I first imagined, and stronger because of it. At midnight, I shut the tablet and placed it beside the gown. Richard wanted me silent so his retirement gala could preserve the identity he had spent decades constructing. I was willing to let him speak first. If he simply thanked his guests and left me alone, the legal cases would continue without a spectacle. If he chose, as he usually did, to build himself up by putting me beneath him, I would not protect the story anymore. I handed my car keys to the young valet at the grand entrance of the Oakmont Country Club, the cool Monday evening breeze catching the heavy silk of my custom emerald gown. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the massive mahogany double doors. The ballroom was a masterpiece of old money architecture and cinematic excess. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden light over 30 circular tables draped in imported white linen. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, upbeat melody in the corner, masking the sound of clinking crystal and the low hum of expensive networking. 150 of my father's most influential banking colleagues, elite business partners, and wealthy church members filled the room. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. I paused near the entrance and studied the room. Richard was at the bar performing confidence for senior bankers and church friends. Bradley stood beside him, checking his phone and trying to hide his panic. The $250,000 bailout had already been burned through by his failing company. My LLC's demand was outstanding, and the HELOC was now frozen. Abigail held his arm in a white designer dress, still acting as though the family's prosperity were unquestioned. I did not slip through the service doors tonight. I walked directly into the center of the ballroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The deep emerald gown fit me flawlessly, a stark contrast to the cheap gray sweaters and faded jeans they were used to seeing me wear. I carried myself with the absolute certainty of a woman who legally owned the ground beneath their feet. The ballroom had been arranged to make Richard look important before he ever stepped onto the stage. His retirement photographs ran in a loop on 2 side screens. Richard shaking hands at ribbon cuttings, Richard at charity golf tournaments, Richard beside executives whose names he mentioned at dinner for years afterward. A printed program described him as a man of integrity, stewardship, and service. I read those 3 words twice. Around me, guests from his bank, church, and country club moved easily between tables, trading stories about promotions and vacations. Several recognized me only after checking the name card at my place. One woman said, "You are the daughter who works from home, right?" before being pulled away by her husband. Another asked whether I was still figuring things out. I answered politely and let the assumption stand. Richard had constructed the audience himself. These were the people whose approval mattered enough to him that he had risked my house to preserve an image of abundance. If I corrected every guest one at a time, he could later call it gossip. If he repeated the lie from the stage, however, the correction would have the same audience and the same microphone. That was why I waited. Across the room, Bradley was pretending to laugh at a joke while repeatedly checking the time. Abigail adjusted his lapel and whispered something that made him snap at her. Richard noticed and immediately moved between them, forcing smiles back onto both faces before a photographer passed. The family portrait lasted 3 seconds. The strain returned as soon as the camera lowered. The reaction was immediate. A few church members turned their heads, whispering behind their champagne flutes as they took in my appearance. Abigail spotted me first. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. She nudged Bradley, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Bradley looked up from his phone, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Finally, my father noticed the shift in the room's attention. He turned, and when his eyes locked onto mine, his confident posture shattered. He marched across the ballroom floor, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He grabbed my upper arm, attempting to pull me out of the central walkway, but I planted my feet firmly and did not move a single inch. "What are you doing wearing that?" my father hissed, keeping his voice low so the nearby banking executives would not hear. "I told you to sit in the back and remain invisible. You look like you are trying to upstage your sister." I gently, but forcefully, removed his hand from my arm. "I am simply dressing appropriately for a retirement gala, Dad," I replied, my voice smooth and carrying just enough volume for the guests at the nearest table to hear. "You invited me to celebrate your long, successful career. I would not want to disrespect you by looking like a freeloader in front of your wealthy friends." Before he could respond, an older man in a sharp charcoal suit approached us. It was William Vance, a senior board member at my father's bank. "Richard," William said, offering a warm smile, "you have been hiding this lovely young woman all evening. Introduce us." My father swallowed hard, a nervous bead of sweat forming at his temple. "William, this is my youngest daughter, Sarah." William Vance, one of the senior board members from Richard's bank, approached me before dinner and extended his hand. "You are Sarah, right? Your father talks endlessly about Abigail and Bradley, but I do not think we have ever actually met." I shook his hand. "We have not." He glanced at the name card near my place. "What line of work are you in?" "Corporate asset recovery and forensic auditing, mostly distressed debt, fraud review, and tracing money when the story around it stops matching the records." His interest sharpened immediately. "Then you understand distressed credits?" "That is a large part of my work." For several minutes we talked about failed acquisitions, revenue recognition problems, and what happens when founders hide bad numbers instead of correcting them early. It was an ordinary professional conversation, which made it feel almost exotic in my family. William never asked how much I earned or whether my clothes were expensive. He simply treated the work as real because he understood it. Richard noticed us from across the ballroom and hurried over. "William," he said brightly, placing a hand on my shoulder, "Sarah is dressing things up. She does some bookkeeping online." William looked from him to me. "She just gave me a better explanation of creditor priority than half the junior lenders I interview." Richard's fingers tightened. "Well, hobbies can become useful." I stepped out from under his hand. "It is not a hobby." For a second, Richard had no answer. Abigail arrived just in time to save him from the silence. She looked me up and down, focusing on the emerald gown. "Did you put that on a credit card?" she asked. "Dad is going to be furious if you are racking up debt while living under his roof." "It is paid for," I said. "You should check on Bradley. He looks like he might faint." She turned. Bradley was leaning against a cocktail table with his phone in one hand and a glass of water in the other. Abigail's irritation shifted instantly toward him, and she marched away. William watched her go, then looked back at me. "Your father seriously never mentioned what you do." My father prefers his version. A server announced that dinner was about to begin. William excused himself, but before leaving, he handed me his card. "Call me next week. My firm uses outside specialists." Richard saw the exchange. The look on his face told me he finally understood that his professional world was capable of meeting me without his introduction. Abigail turned to look at Bradley, who was currently leaning heavily against a tall cocktail table, rubbing his temples with trembling hands. She scowled and stormed off to manage him, leaving me to enjoy the rest of the dinner service in absolute, terrifying peace. I took my assigned seat near the back of the room, exactly where my father had demanded I sit. From my table near the back, I studied the people Richard had spent his career trying to impress. There were senior lenders, retired executives, local business owners, church elders, and couples who knew my family mostly through country club dinners. Several had probably heard stories about me for years. I could tell from the polite smiles that some expected the awkward, dependent daughter Richard described. The emerald gown disrupted that picture, but clothing alone proved nothing. That was why I did not circulate trying to correct the record before the speech. I answered William Vance's question about my profession and returned to my seat. I wanted Richard to make his own choice in front of the room. He could finish his retirement speech without humiliating me and leave with his reputation intact until the legal process unfolded privately. Or he could use the microphone the way he always used family gatherings, as a weapon. I had not told him what to say. I had not baited him. The next move belonged to him. When he stepped onto the stage and began praising legacy, discipline, and family values, I realized he had learned nothing from the week of panic around him. Even with the HELOC frozen and Bradley unraveling, Richard still believed appearance could overpower fact. Then his eyes found me and the familiar smirk returned. I ate my roasted tenderloin slowly, watching my family perform their desperate charade of wealth and success, knowing the clock was ticking down to zero. Dinner concluded just as the jazz quartet stopped playing. The waiters swiftly cleared the silver chargers and heavy porcelain plates from the tables. A sharp, ringing sound echoed through the ballroom as someone tapped a spoon against a crystal glass. The low hum of conversation faded into expectant silence. My father walked proudly onto the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. He adjusted his custom tuxedo jacket, ran a hand over his silver hair, and grasped the microphone. "Thank you, everyone," my father began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for joining me tonight. Looking out at this incredible room, I see 35 years of hard work, dedication, and unbreakable partnerships. I see the people who helped me build a legacy in the banking industry." The crowd offered a warm, respectful round of applause. My father placed a hand over his heart, soaking in their admiration like a man starving for validation. Dinner moved slowly. Richard circulated between courses, receiving compliments on the program and stopping at my table only once to remind me that his speech was about legacy and that I should not make a scene. I told him I understood. Across the room, Bradley ignored most of his meal. He kept checking a legal email on his phone, then locking the screen whenever Abigail leaned toward him. At one point, he left the table and returned 5 minutes later with his face freshly washed, but his collar still damp. The room interpreted his tension as emotion about Richard's retirement. I knew better. Robert had confirmed that Apex's cure deadline was approaching, and that the bank's restriction on the HELOC remained in place. I did not need to mention either fact. Bradley was carrying them visibly. Near the audio-visual booth, the technician tested the projector with a slideshow of Richard's career photographs. I watched the input switch on the control panel and noted the adapter port. My own device had already been tested with the same standard connection at Robert's office. When the room lights dimmed for dessert, the stage screens brightened, and Richard walked toward the microphone with the relaxed confidence of a man who still believed every system in the room belonged to him. But true success is not measured in boardrooms, he continued, his tone shifting into practiced artificial warmth. It is measured by the family you build. I am so proud of my beautiful daughter Abigail and her husband Bradley. Bradley is a visionary, a man who is currently taking the technology world by storm. He understands the value of hard work, and he knows how to build an empire the right way. Bradley offered a weak, trembling wave from his table. The guests clapped loudly, unaware that the supposed tech visionary was currently bankrupt and facing federal investigation. Then, my father's eyes scanned the room. He looked past the VIP tables, past his wealthy friends, until his gaze landed on me, sitting quietly in the shadows near the back exit. A cruel, familiar smirk spread across his face. He leaned closer to the microphone, preparing to assert his dominance one final time. "And of course, we have my youngest daughter, Sarah," he announced, pointing directly at me. The spotlight seemed to shift, drawing 150 pairs of eyes toward my table. My father let out a theatrical sigh, shaking his head with mock pity. "Sarah is also here tonight. She is 29 years old, has no degree that matters, no future prospects, and just freeloads off the family. But we love her anyway, right?" The laughter hit the room immediately. It started with chuckles from the front row and swelled into a wave of rolling amusement across the entire ballroom. The wealthy executives, the church members, the people who claimed to be upstanding citizens, all threw their heads back and laughed at my public humiliation. I saw Abigail smiling widely at her table, thoroughly enjoying the moment. I saw my father standing on the stage, looking immensely satisfied, believing he had successfully put the useless daughter back in her proper place. The laughter rolled across the ballroom and then began to thin as I stood. I lifted my glass and waited until enough people were looking at me. "Cheers," I said. "Take a good look. This is the last time any of you will see me." Richard's smile faltered. Abigail looked delighted, as if I had finally given the room the humiliation she expected. Bradley looked relieved. I turned toward the rear doors and walked away while the guests watched. I reached the corridor, past the main exit, and kept going toward the audio-visual booth. From inside the ballroom, it looked as if I had left the club. That assumption gave me the few seconds I needed. My tablet was inside my clutch, the casting adapter secured to the back. Through the narrow booth window, I could see Richard still holding the microphone, trying to turn the awkward silence into another laugh. I had no intention of disappearing into the parking lot. I was simply moving to the one place in the building where I could put the records in front of the same people who had just accepted his version of me without question. The technician at the soundboard looked up as I entered the open audiovisual booth. I set my clutch on the counter and pulled out the tablet I had prepared the night before. "Ma'am, this area is for staff," he said, half rising from his chair. "I need 30 seconds on the main display," I said. "The material concerns a documented fraud involving the guest of honor and financial professionals in this room. You can stay right here and watch exactly what I put on the screen." He hesitated. That second was enough. I connected my tablet to the presentation input and mirrored the prepared file to the ballroom screens. Richard saw where I had gone and pointed toward the booth. "Turn that off," my father shouted from the stage. "Get her away from there." The screens came alive before anyone moved. The bright display replaced the retirement graphics behind Richard, and conversations stopped across the room. The first document appeared on the massive screens. It was not a nostalgic photo of a happy family memory. It was the certified legal deed to my grandmother's sprawling estate. The text was magnified so large that every single banking executive sitting in the back row could read it clearly. The document proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the sole and absolute legal owner of the property my father claimed to provide. "What is this?" a man sitting at the front table asked aloud, leaning forward to read the projected text. My father turned around to look at the screens. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his custom tuxedo. "Turn it off!" he screamed at the confused technician. "Cut the main power to the projectors right now!" I stepped firmly between the technician and the master power switch. "Do not touch that switch," I told the young man, projecting absolute professional authority. The first slide appeared behind Richard while he was still trying to regain the room. It showed the county deed with my name as sole owner. A few people stopped whispering. The next slide showed the disputed HELOC file. I did not read the pages aloud. The banking professionals in the room knew what they were looking at. The mood changed before Richard could reach the booth. One executive leaned forward to see the signature block. Another turned to the colleague beside her and pointed at the notary acknowledgement. Abigail stood so quickly that her chair struck the table behind her. Bradley remained seated, but the color drained from his face. The third slide traced the transfer from the HELOC draw to Apex Tech Solutions. That was when the room became quiet enough to hear Richard's shoes crossing the floor. "Turn that off," he said. Nobody laughed now. Richard reached for the tablet. I moved it out of his hand. "The originals are preserved by the bank and my attorney," I said. "Destroying a screen will not change a record." He stopped. Behind him, the people who had applauded his career were reading the dates. Several had spent their own careers in lending, compliance, and risk. They did not need me to explain why a sole owner's property should not carry a loan she denied signing. William Vance, a senior board member from Richard's bank, rose from his table and asked the question Richard had been trying to avoid all evening. "Did you authorize this loan, Sarah?" "No." "Did you sign those documents?" "No." That two-word exchange did more damage than another 5 minutes of exposition could have done. William turned toward Richard. "Then you need counsel, not a microphone." A woman near the front, whom I recognized as a retired compliance director, asked whether the bank had been notified. "Yes," I said. "There is a formal dispute and an identity theft report." She nodded once and looked at Richard with an expression that carried more weight than outrage. Another guest quietly asked the person beside him to photograph the screen. A church elder who had laughed at Richard's joke lowered his glass and stared at the table. The social temperature changed in layers. Some people were shocked by the fraud. Others were embarrassed that they had laughed at the person who owned the house Richard claimed to provide. A few were already calculating what the allegations meant for Richard's former employer. Richard tried to retake the microphone. "This is a family disagreement," he said. "Sarah has always been emotional about money." William answered before I could. "A forged lien is not a family disagreement." The sentence moved through the room like a door closing. Richard looked toward Bradley for help. Bradley looked at the floor. Richard reached the edge of the booth and stopped beneath the projection of his own loan file. "It was a temporary family arrangement," he said. "I was going to repay it before the first statement arrived." William did not move. "Did Sarah authorize you to sign for her?" Richard looked at me instead of answering him. "She is my daughter." "That was not the question," William said. The room had become so quiet that Richard's pause felt like an answer. Finally, he said, "It is a family house." I touched the tablet and returned the screen to the recorded deed. "It is my house." A murmur moved through the tables. Richard's friends were not reacting to a dramatic accusation anymore. They were reacting to his inability to answer a simple question. One retired lender took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. A church member who had laughed minutes earlier stared at his plate. Richard tried to shift the discussion toward repayment, insisting that no one had lost money yet. William cut him off again. Whether you intended to repay it does not answer how her signature appeared on a lien against property she owns. Richard opened his mouth and then closed it. For the first time in my life, I watched him run out of language. I turned the screen away from the HELOC documents. Richard did not risk my house for a thriving company, I said. He did it for Apex Tech Solutions. One slide showed Bradley's existing commercial default and the assignment of that debt to my holding company. That was all. I did not walk the room through every clause. The people who understood lending could read the heading, dates, and creditor name for themselves. Abigail shook her head violently. Bradley's company is expanding. He has investors. Bradley stayed seated. His eyes had locked onto the name of the holding company. He had seen it before, on the demand letter that arrived after the vow renewal. You? He said. That company is you? It is mine. The realization hit Abigail a second later. The sister she had demanded catering money from had paid the deposit and, through a separate legal transaction, acquired the debt her husband could not pay. Bradley stood so quickly that his water glass tipped across the table. You had no right to get into my private company records. I did not get into your servers, I said. Your lender sold a defaulted note. My company bought it through counsel. The records on this screen came with that transaction and from public filings. He looked around for someone to tell him I was bluffing. Nobody did. The demand is real, I continued. Apex had already defaulted before I became involved. The $250,000 from the HELOC paid old bills and bought you time, but it did not make the company solvent. Bradley's jaw tightened. We have a funding round coming. Then your attorney can answer the demand with evidence of funds and a cure proposal. Instead, 2 nights ago, you were in the coat room telling your partner to move equipment before the creditor could reach it. His face changed. I did not play the recording. I did not need to. He knew exactly what he had said. For several seconds, Bradley simply stared at me. Then the polished founder persona disappeared. That money was supposed to bridge us, he said, turning toward Richard. You told me the bank would never question it. Abigail grabbed his arm. What money? He pulled away. The HELOC, the one against Sarah's house. The admission landed harder than another slide could have. Abigail looked from him to Richard, finally understanding that the financial crisis was not something I had invented at the gala. Richard snapped that Bradley had begged for help. Bradley shouted back that Richard had promised the paperwork was safe. Their argument gave the room what my presentation could not. 2 participants confirming the scheme while trying to blame each other. I lowered the tablet. There was nothing left to explain. William Vance, the senior board member who had praised my father just an hour earlier, stood up from his chair. His face was rigid with professional disgust. He did not yell, but his voice carried the lethal authority of a man protecting his own wealth. Richard, William said, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket, you have disgraced your bank. You have disgraced your colleagues. If you think for 1 second that our institution will shield you from federal fraud charges, you are delusional. I am calling the compliance board right now, and I strongly suggest you find a criminal defense attorney before tomorrow morning. William turned his back on my father and walked straight down the center aisle, signaling for the rest of the banking executives to follow him. They did. Dozens of powerful men and women abandoned their half-eaten desserts and headed for the cloakroom, refusing to spend another minute inside a room hosted by a confessed felon. Abigail could not handle the exodus. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes, and she reacted with pure, unhinged denial. She pushed her chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed against the polished marble floor. "This is a lie!" Abigail screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the crystal chandeliers. She marched toward me, her designer gown swishing aggressively around her ankles. "She is lying to all of you! My sister is a jealous, bitter secretary who lives in our spare bedroom for free. She printed these fake papers to ruin my husband's reputation because she is a miserable failure. Bradley is a tech visionary. We are buying a house in Aspen. You cannot listen to her." What happened next was quieter than shouting and far more damaging. People began creating distance. The retired compliance director picked up her clutch and moved away from Richard's table. Two former colleagues who had been waiting to congratulate him stepped into the hallway to make calls. A church couple who had laughed at his joke avoided his eyes. The withdrawal spread through the room without anyone announcing it. Richard kept looking for one familiar face that would signal the story could still be contained. He did not find one. William took out his phone and told someone at his bank that there was a potential fraud matter involving a former senior executive and that the compliance chair needed to be contacted immediately. He did not dramatize it or threaten Richard. He simply treated the information as something that had to be reported. That professional response seemed to frighten my father more than anger would have. Anger could be dismissed as personal. Procedure could not. Near the back, the audiovisual technician had stopped touching the controls. He stood with both hands flat on the console, watching the room as though he had accidentally become part of a deposition. Several guests were recording, but many were not. They were simply listening as Richard and Bradley began blaming each other in full sentences that no public relations advisor could later soften. The gala had been designed as a final celebration of Richard's reputation. Within minutes, the room had become a place where the people who mattered most to that reputation were deciding how quickly they needed to separate themselves from him. Abigail rushed toward me and reached for the tablet. I stepped aside. "The documents are already preserved," I said. "Taking this out of my hand changes nothing." She turned toward the screens instead, scanning them as though she might discover a typo large enough to save her. "This is fake. Bradley is successful. Dad owns the house. Sarah lives with us for free." Nobody laughed with her. "The deed is a county record," I said. "The bank has the disputed loan file. Your husband's default was issued before I ever became his creditor. And the catering deposit for your vow renewal came from me because Bradley's cards were already failing." Abigail stared at me. The insult she had used for years, freeloader, suddenly had nowhere to land. She turned on Bradley. "Tell me she is lying." He could not. Bradley's admission changed the room more than my slides had. Guests who might have dismissed a daughter's accusation as family bitterness had just heard him confirm the HELOC while arguing with Richard about who was responsible. Phones came out. Others did the opposite and put their phones away, suddenly aware that they were standing inside something that might become evidence rather than entertainment. A few of Richard's former colleagues left their tables and moved toward the hallway to make calls. The retired compliance director, who had questioned me earlier, spoke quietly with William Vance. Neither looked at Richard. Abigail seemed unable to understand why nobody was rushing to defend her. She kept repeating that Bradley had investors and that Richard owned the house, but each statement now collided with something the room had already seen or heard. The social collapse was not a single explosion. It happened by subtraction. People stopped smiling. They stopped approaching Richard. They stopped treating his explanations as authoritative. A church couple who had laughed at his joke would not meet his eyes. One former colleague who had been waiting to congratulate him picked up his coat without saying goodbye. Richard looked from face to face as if one friendly expression could restore the evening. He did not find one. The gala had been designed as a final celebration of his reputation. Within minutes, the people whose approval mattered most to him were deciding how quickly they needed to distance themselves. I left Bradley and Abigail beside their table and walked toward Richard. For the first time that night, he looked smaller than the room he had rented to celebrate himself. "Sarah," he said, "we can fix this. I can move money from my retirement accounts. I can pay the line back. We tell the bank it was a misunderstanding." I took a manila envelope from my clutch and placed it on the cocktail table between us. "A misunderstanding does not require someone to practice my signature," I said, "and it does not require a false notarization." Inside were 3 things: the 30-day notice to vacate my property, the bank's written confirmation that the HELOC was formally disputed and restricted, and a copy of the identity theft report already in Detective Bennett's file. Richard read the eviction notice twice. "You are throwing your own family out? I am ending your use of a house you never owned." He looked at the next page and saw that no further draws could be made while the bank investigated the origination and lien. Then he reached the police report. The anger drained from his face. "You went to the police?" "Yes. You planned all of this before tonight. I started protecting myself after I learned what you did." He glanced toward Abigail as if she might turn the moment into a family plea, but she was demanding answers from Bradley and barely seemed aware of us. "What about your mother?" Richard asked. "The notice covers the adults occupying the property. Your attorney can discuss logistics with Robert." I kept the conversation practical because there was nothing left to negotiate emotionally. The house was not collateral for an apology, and the fraud report was not a bargaining chip I could trade for a promise that he would respect me next time. Richard folded the papers badly, creasing one across the center. 30 days, he muttered. "Where are we supposed to go?" "That is something you should discuss with your family and your lawyer." His jaw tightened. "You have become cruel." I looked at the documents in his hand. "No, I have become specific." Then I stepped away. I had spent years allowing every boundary to dissolve into a conversation about gratitude, loyalty, and what families supposedly owed one another. Those pages ended that pattern. Each one named a fact, a deadline, or a process that did not depend on Richard agreeing with me. I turned my back on the ballroom and walked out through the country club doors. This time, I really left. The valet brought my sedan around, and I drove to a small hotel downtown rather than return to the house while Richard and Bradley were still in shock. Robert had advised me not to be alone with either man immediately after the confrontation. By the time I locked the hotel door, my phone showed dozens of calls and messages. Richard demanded that I call him before I destroyed the family. Abigail accused me of humiliating her and claimed I had planned the entire night out of jealousy. Bradley sent the only message that sounded remotely practical. He wanted his lawyer to discuss the commercial debt with the new creditor. Several guests from the gala sent embarrassed apologies for laughing at Richard's joke. I forwarded anything relevant to Robert and left the rest unanswered. The next morning, Robert called before 8. Richard had retained counsel. Bradley's attorney had contacted the holding company's counsel, and First National Trust wanted a follow-up interview regarding the disputed HELOC. "This is the part where spectacle ends," Robert said. "From here on, dates and documents matter more than what anyone shouted in that ballroom." I agreed. The public confrontation had ended Richard's ability to control the social story, but it did not replace any legal process. I checked out of the hotel, went directly to Robert's office, and spent the morning signing follow-up authorizations, preserving messages, and confirming that all communication about the house would go through counsel. I did not return home until the arrangements for the eviction period and my personal safety were clear. Over the next week, the consequences moved into quieter rooms. First National Trust interviewed me again, preserved the origination records, and continued reviewing the conduct of the employees involved. The disputed lien moved into the formal fraud and title process. Detective Bennett requested additional records through the channels available to him. Richard's attorney contacted Robert with 2 proposals. Richard would try to repay the HELOC if I withdrew the identity theft complaint, and he would sign a statement acknowledging that I owned the house if I rescinded the eviction. Neither proposal changed the facts. Repayment could reduce financial damage, but it could not turn a forged signature into consent. I did not need Richard to grant me ownership of property already recorded in my name. Robert reminded me again not to treat a strong evidence file as a guaranteed criminal outcome. The bank, investigators, and prosecutors would make their own decisions. My responsibility was narrower: protect the property, preserve the evidence, and enforce the boundaries I had finally set. The 30-day notice created its own tension. Richard initially threatened to challenge the deed, then stopped mentioning the idea after his lawyer reviewed the county record. Abigail asked for extensions because apartment hunting was impossible under this stress. Robert allowed reasonable scheduling for movers, but did not reopen the deadline. Bradley communicated only through counsel. During the final week, the house lost the theatrical confidence it once carried. Boxes appeared along the upstairs hallway. The framed photographs Richard displayed at country club dinners came down from the living room shelves. Abigail packed the designer handbags first. Richard spent hours in the office sorting files and occasionally emerging to accuse me of destroying the family. I did not argue. The notice had a date. The movers had a date. There was nothing useful left to debate. On the final morning, a county deputy remained near the property while the last boxes were loaded and the keys were surrendered. Richard handed his over without looking at me. Abigail cried in the driveway and asked whether I was really going to let them leave. The notice was real, I said. That was the only answer I gave. When the final car pulled away, I changed the locks and walked through the house alone. Without Richard's voice attached to every room, the place looked surprisingly ordinary. The staircase still creaked near the third step. Afternoon light still crossed the living room floor. The kitchen counter was the same counter where he had ordered me to scrub a roasting pan to earn my keep. Nothing in the architecture had changed. What changed was the authority inside it. 3 months after the gala, Robert gave me the broader update in his office. Apex had entered liquidation after failing to cure its debts and satisfy other creditors. Its office lease ended, remaining equipment was inventoried, and assets were sold through the appropriate process. The proceeds did not make everyone whole. They were distributed according to valid priorities and claims. Bradley no longer controlled the company he had spent years presenting as proof of his genius. Prosecutors had indicted him on fraud-related counts tied to investor representations and his participation in the HELOC scheme. Richard faced his own criminal case and substantial defense costs. His former employer had severed ties after its internal review, and the country club suspended his membership while the matter remained pending. Robert was precise about the language. An indictment was an accusation, not a conviction. No responsible attorney could promise me a sentence. The practical consequences, however, were already visible. Bradley had lost Apex. Richard was liquidating retirement investments to pay white-collar counsel. The reputation he expected to enjoy after 35 years in banking had become the subject of formal reviews and careful legal statements. By then, I had moved my work setup from the cramped bedroom into the former home office. I kept the changes to the house simple. I replaced the heavy curtains, moved Richard's oversized desk out, brought some of my grandmother's furniture down from storage, and chose a long dining table meant for people who actually liked being together. I did not need to tear the place apart to prove it was mine. Ownership had already been established by the deed and by the boundaries I was finally willing to enforce. The first morning I worked from the new office, I wore sweatpants and an old hoodie. At 10, I joined a call with outside counsel on a corporate fraud matter. At noon, I made soup in my own kitchen. From the street, nothing about the day looked impressive. That made me smile. Richard had spent his life believing success only counted when strangers could see it. A few weeks later, I invited Robert and several close friends to dinner. There was no seating chart, no microphone, and no ranking of who had achieved the most. People brought bread, salad, and dessert, even though I told them not to bring anything. We ate too much, argued about music, laughed loudly, and left dishes in the sink until morning. Robert eventually raised his glass and said, "To reading the fine print." Everyone laughed. I did too. Standing in that kitchen after they left, I understood that taking my power back had not really been the moment the projector turned on. It had been every practical decision around it. Checking the title, preserving records, getting counsel, reporting the fraud, enforcing a real contract, serving a real eviction notice, and refusing to reopen a door simply because the people outside it were family. Love does not require you to finance someone else's lies. Loyalty does not require you to ignore theft because the thief shares your last name. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant absorbing humiliation and quietly paying the bills. All that did was teach my family that my boundaries were negotiable. I still work remotely. I still prefer comfortable clothes. I still have no interest in performing success for strangers. The difference is that I no longer allow anyone to turn those choices into evidence that I am worth less than they are. Have you ever had to take your power back from a family that underestimated you? Let me know in the comments. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Until next time, remember, your worth is not defined by those who use you,